horrifying, deafening sound that splits the difference between a guttural animal roar and a jagged, wet scream.
I know what I went through is bizarre, and every time I try to talk about it, it comes out sounding even weirder than it actually was. People want a monster story with a clean beginning. What I've got is an apartment building in Jamaica Plain that never once, in 14 months, gave me anything clean. The night it started, the fire alarm went off around 11:40. Not the little chirp you get from a dead battery, the real one, the horn strobe combo that makes your ribs vibrate. I was already in bed, half asleep with a laptop still warm on my chest. And I did what everybody does. I assumed it was nothing, grabbed my phone and my keys, and went down the stairwell instead of waiting for confirmation like a responsible adult. Outside, the sidewalk on Center Street had that specific look a building gets when it empties itself out at midnight. People in bathrobes, people barefoot, a guy holding a cat like a football. Denise, the property manager, was already out front in a puffer coat over pajama pants, doing a head count nobody had asked her to do. 2 engines from the Boylston Street station had already pulled up, lights turning the brick red and then blue and then red again. I didn't think anything was actually wrong. I've lived in enough old buildings to know that half the alarms are a bad sensor in the trash chute, or somebody's grease fire that put itself out before anyone noticed. I was mostly annoyed. I had a job in Somerville at 8 the next morning, and I wanted my 6 hours back. That's when I looked up. Our building is 6 stories, brick with those old fire escapes zigzagging down the front. And I have a habit, everybody who lives somewhere long enough gets this habit, of finding my own window in a crowd like that. 3rd floor, second from the left, dark, obviously, since I was the one standing outside. I found it fine. My eyes just kept climbing past it out of nervous energy, counting floors the way you count sheep. 5th floor, one of the corner units, 5C. I knew 5C. Everybody on that side of the building knew 5C, because it had been empty since the spring. The guy who lived there got a job transfer, broke his lease, and Denise had been in the process of relisting it for going on 2 months, which in property manager language means nobody's touched it. I'd actually been up there myself in April, running a new outlet for the next tenant who never showed. Empty, boxes gone, nothing on the walls. The light in 5C wasn't on. That's important, because at first I thought I was imagining a shape, and it was just a shadow thrown by the fire truck lights sweeping across the glass. But the shape moved, and it moved wrong. It crossed the room low, close to the floor. The way you'd cross a room if you were following a dropped contact lens. Except it was fast. Faster than someone crawling has any business being, and the proportions were off in a way I couldn't file anywhere useful in my head. Wide across the shoulders. Something about the back that caught the red light from the trucks and held onto it a second too long, like the light was landing on wet fabric instead of skin. Moved to the far wall and then it just wasn't there anymore. No flash of a person standing up. No silhouette against the window a second later. Gone. The way something goes when it steps sideways into a part of the room you can't see from the street. "Hey," I said to nobody, and grabbed the sleeve of the guy next to me, some dude from the 4th floor I only knew as the guy with the drum kit. He looked up where I was pointing. By the time his eyes found the window, there was nothing there but glass reflecting the trucks. "What am I looking at?" he said, not really asking. "There's somebody in 5C. Isn't that the empty one?" "Yeah," I said. "That's the thing." He gave the window 4 more seconds of genuine attention. The kind of scrutiny people give something before they decide it's not their problem. And then he pulled his phone out and started filming the fire trucks instead, because that was at least going to be a story with an ending. The all clear came about 20 minutes later. A sensor fault in the trash room. Exactly the kind of thing I would have bet on if you had asked me before any of this happened. Everybody filed back inside grumbling about the cold. I stood on the sidewalk a beat longer than I needed to, looking at a dark window that had gone back to being just a dark window, telling myself I'd seen a reflection, or a curtain nobody had taken down, or my own tired brain doing what tired brains do at midnight. I want to be clear that I didn't believe any of that. I just needed somewhere to put the next 20 minutes while I walked back up 3 flights of stairs past a floor I was suddenly in no hurry to reach. Back inside, the The stairwell smelled the way it always did after everybody funneled through it at once. Cold air, wet coat, somebody's cigarette still clinging to a hoodie. I took the stairs slower than usual, telling myself it was just tiredness, not the fact that my route home ran directly past the 4th and 5th floor landings. On 4, the drum kit guy's door was already shut, TV volume climbing back up like nothing had happened. On 5, I stopped without meaning to. The hallway was empty, fluorescent light doing its usual flicker over the numbers on 5C's door. A plain brass 5, a plain brass C, nothing unusual, no line of light underneath, no sound. I stood there long enough to feel stupid about it, then kept going. By the time I got to my own door on 3, I'd almost talked myself out of the whole thing. Almost. I still checked the peephole twice before I went to bed, which wasn't something I normally did. For a couple of days, I actually let it go. That's the part people never believe when I tell this story, that I had a genuinely normal Tuesday and Wednesday after seeing something crawl across an empty apartment. But that's how it works when you've got a mortgage-sized rent bill and a business that runs on you showing up. I had a panel upgrade in Somerville, a ceiling fan install in Dorchester that turned into a 2-hour fight with a junction box some previous electrician had wired like he was mad at the house, and a stack of invoices I kept meaning to send out. Life doesn't stop being boring just because you saw something weird for 4 seconds on a sidewalk. Thursday morning, I ran into Denise in the lobby. She was doing her usual loop, checking the mailroom, straightening the flyer board nobody reads, generally patrolling the building like she owned more of it than she actually did. Denise managed 4 properties for the same landlord, a guy named Petrosian who I'd met exactly once at a lease signing, and who I was pretty sure lived in Florida now. "You're up early," she said, which was her version of small talk. Denise didn't do weather. Job in Somerville. I held the door for her out of habit, then didn't actually walk through it. "Hey, quick thing, 5C. Is that still empty?" She gave me the look she gives when a question costs her more effort than she wants to spend before 9 a.m. "Should be. Why, you hearing something up there?" That was interesting, actually, that she jumped straight to hearing something instead of asking why I was asking. But I didn't clock it as interesting until much later. At the time, I just said no, nothing like that. Thought I saw a light the other night during the alarm thing. Probably the emergency lighting. Those units still have the battery packs in the hallway. They can throw glare into a room if the door's open. She said it fast. The kind of fast that isn't a lie, exactly. Just a sentence somebody said enough times that it doesn't need thinking anymore. "You want me to send Marcus up to check the doors locked?" "Nah, I can look if Marcus is around. He still has to let me in. But I know the wiring in that wing from the outlet job in the spring." "Right." She was already moving toward the mailroom. "Let me know if the paint's peeling or whatever. I want it list ready by fall." That was it. That was the whole conversation. And if you'd asked me that afternoon whether anything about it bothered me, I would have said no. It wasn't until I was up a ladder in Dorchester, stripping wire with my teeth because I'd left my strippers in the truck again, that it came back to me sideways. She never asked what the light looked like. Not what shape, not what color, not how long. She skipped straight past the description and landed on an explanation, like she already had one loaded and ready to go regardless of what I'd actually seen. I told myself that was just Denise being Denise. She managed buildings the way some people manage anxiety, by not leaving room for follow-up questions. I didn't go up to 5 that day. I told myself I would. And then I got a call about a tripped breaker in a unit on the 2nd floor. Spent 40 minutes convincing an 80-year-old named Mr. Viore that his space heater was the problem and not the wiring in this whole rotten building. And by the time I was done with that, I'd lost the appetite for climbing 2 more flights to stare at a door. Friday, though, I had an actual reason. A woman named Priya, who lived on 4 with a dog she was clearly not supposed to have according to the lease, texted the building group chat asking if anyone else's radiator was banging like someone was hitting it with a wrench. I don't do the group chat much, but radiators are sort of my department by default, since I'm the only person in the building who owns a multimeter and isn't afraid of the boiler room. I told her I'd take a look. Her apartment was 2 doors down from 5C, same side of the building, and when I let myself into the hallway to head to her place, I did what I said I wouldn't do and stood outside 5C for a second. Nothing. No smell, no sound, no light under the door. Just a hallway that needed repainting and a fire extinguisher case with a cracked latch that had been on my mental to-do list since March. Priya answered her door with the dog already barking somewhere behind her. A scruffy little terrier mix named, unfortunately, Nugget, and let me in past a hallway covered in framed photos of places that weren't Boston. The radiator turned out to be exactly what I expected. Trapped air, an easy bleed with the little key, 5 minutes of work tops. While I was crouched by it, she asked, casual, not even really looking at me, "Hey, did you see anything weird during the fire alarm thing?" Nugget totally lost it, like growling at the door for 20 minutes after we got back inside. He never does that. I could have told her what I saw, I almost did, but something about saying it out loud in a stranger's living room, 5 days later, in broad Friday afternoon daylight, made it sound insane in a way it hadn't felt at the time. So I gave her the Denise answer instead, more or less. Emergency lighting throws weird reflections sometimes. Probably just smelled the trucks or the smoke from whatever tripped the sensor. Maybe, she said, not sounding convinced, scooping Nugget up when he started scratching at the hallway facing door again. Right that second, for no reason either of us could see. I finished the radiator, told her to flush it again in a week if it kept knocking, and left. On my way to the stairs, I passed 5C one more time. Nugget's barking followed me the whole length of the hallway, muffled through Priya's door, and it didn't stop until I was down a full flight and out of earshot, which struck me as a strange amount of barking for a dog who'd supposedly settled right back down 5 days ago, and an even stranger amount for a hallway with nothing in it but an empty apartment and a cracked fire extinguisher case. The wiring job came up almost by accident, which is usually how the worst discoveries happen. You're not looking for anything. You're just doing your regular job, and the building hands you something it didn't mean to. Denise called me Monday morning asking if I could take a look at 5D, the unit next to 5C, before a showing that week. Not 5C, 5D. Different unit, same floor. Opposite side of the hallway from Priya's place, which put it right across from the one apartment I'd been actively avoiding for 6 days. The tenant had moved out at the end of July, and the new prospective renter wanted to make sure the kitchen outlets could handle a window AC unit before they signed anything. Standard stuff. I'd done a dozen jobs exactly like it. Marcus let me into 5D around 11, left me with the unit key, and told me to lock up when I was done. Toolbox in one hand, flashlight in the other. The first thing I noticed had nothing to do with outlets. The apartment was staged empty. No furniture, no boxes, just bare walls and the smell every vacant unit gets after a few weeks. Dust and old paint and the ghost of somebody's air freshener. But there was a second smell underneath it. Faint. The kind of thing you'd miss if you walked in and out fast. Something like a duck that had gotten wet once and never fully dried, mixed with a burnt plasticky edge, like the smell that comes off an appliance cord that's been overheating for weeks without anybody noticing. I'd smelled that exact combination before, on a service call for a dying furnace blower motor. It wasn't dangerous exactly in small doses, but it wasn't nothing either. I checked the kitchen outlets first, because that's what I was there for, and they were fine. A little loose in the box, nothing that would stop an AC unit from running. It was on my way out when I ducked into the hall closet to check the electrical panel for the unit, that I found the vent. Every apartment on that side of the building shares a return air chase that runs up through a utility closet, feeding into the building's old shared HVAC trunk, a leftover from whenever this place got converted from single family to units, the kind of half-updated system that passes inspection, but makes every electrician who touches it a little nervous. The grill covering the return in 5D's closet was hanging by one screw instead of 4, tilted down at an angle like something had pushed it from the inside. I don't scare easy on a job site. I've opened enough panels and crawled enough basements to know that old buildings are full of things that look worse than they are. Rat damage, water stains that used to be leaks, insulation some contractor from 1987 installed wrong. So my first move was professional, not panicked. I got my flashlight out and looked into the duct. The sheet metal about 2 feet back was dented inward, not the kind of dent you get from age or a stray tool bumping it during a renovation, but a dent with a shape to it, wide at the top, tapering like something heavy had leaned its full weight against the metal from one direction, and stayed there long enough to bend it permanently. Around the edge of the dent, the metal was scored with thin, parallel lines, 4 or 5 of them together, close enough in spacing that they hadn't come from any tool I owned or recognized. I sat back on my heels and looked at that for longer than I want to admit. The return chase in that closet fed all the way up to the unit above, and, if I was remembering the building's layout right, connected somewhere near the mechanical closet that served both 5C and 5D, a shared space, sealed off from the units themselves but accessible from a service hatch in the hallway that Marcus, the building's longtime super, kept locked, mostly because nobody had bothered fixing the ladder inside in a decade. I got up, closed the grill as best I could with 1 screw doing the work of 4, and stood there a second in that hall closet with my flashlight off, just listening. Old buildings make noise all day long, pipes ticking as they heat up, someone's footsteps 2 floors up sounding like they're right above your head, the elevator shaft groaning through the walls like something alive. I know that. I've made peace with that for 14 years of doing this job. But the sound I heard then didn't fit any of the building's usual noises. It was low, and it was inside the wall, not above it or beside it. A kind of shifting weight, slow, deliberate, moving from somewhere near the closet toward the direction of 5C. I didn't wait around to identify it further. I finished checking the panel, wrote up my notes for Denise. Outlet's fine. Return grill needs resecuring. Recommend having someone look at duct damage before showing. And left that apartment faster than the job strictly required. Downstairs, I found Marcus in the boiler room, doing his usual afternoon rounds with a coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Marcus had been the super at that building longer than Denise had been managing it, long enough that he still called it by its old management company's name half the time. He was maybe 60, built like a guy who'd spent 30 years lifting things he shouldn't have without a dolly, and generally not somebody who volunteered information. "You know anything about damage in the return duct up on 5? I asked him, keeping it casual, like I was asking about a leaky faucet. "Closet outside 5D. Grill's about to fall off and there's a dent in the metal that looks off." Marcus didn't answer right away. He took a sip of the cold coffee, made a face at it, and set it down on top of the boiler like it had personally disappointed him. "That whole chase has been giving trouble for years," he said finally. "I keep telling Petrosian it needs replacing. Old metal, old building, things dent." "Sure," I said. "This just didn't look like age to me." He looked at me then, actually looked in a way he usually didn't bother to. "You go up in that hatch closet? The mechanical one?" "No, just the return in 5D's hall closet." "Good," he said, and picked his coffee back up, which apparently was the end of the conversation as far as he was concerned. "Leave the hatch closet to me. Ladder's bad in there. Somebody's gonna break their neck." It wasn't an answer. I noticed that even then, standing in a boiler room that smelled like gas and old motor oil, watching a 60-year-old man very deliberately not tell me something. But I let it go, because I had 2 more jobs that day, and no good way to turn "leave the hatch closet to me" into an actual conversation. I wrote my notes up for Denise that night, recommend inspection of duct system floor 5, and sent them off, and told myself that was the extent of my involvement. A maintenance issue for somebody else's payroll to deal with. I didn't believe that even as I typed it. I just needed something to believe until I figured out what I actually wanted to do about the sound I'd heard moving inside that wall. I didn't hear back from Denise about the duct. I checked twice, once Wednesday, once Thursday, and both times she gave me some version of "on the list," which in property manager language meant it had been filed somewhere between "someday" and "never." I told myself it wasn't my problem. I'd flagged it. I'd done my job. Whatever lived in that chase, if anything actually lived in it, and I hadn't just spent an afternoon spooking myself over rat damage and bad acoustics, wasn't something I was contractually obligated to chase down with a flashlight. That lasted until Thursday night, a little after 1 in the morning, when Nugget started barking like the building was on fire again. I was awake anyway. I'd been up late finishing a quote for a job in Roslindale. Laptop glowing on the kitchen table, the rest of the apartment dark. The barking came through 2 floors of old plaster and lath clear enough that I could tell it wasn't the normal dog hears a siren bark. It had a rhythm to it, frantic and then pausing. Frantic and then pausing. The kind of bark that means a dog is standing at a door and doesn't want to be any closer to whatever's on the other side of it. I went out onto my landing in socks. No real plan, just curiosity dressed up as concern. The stairwell light on 3 was doing its usual half-hearted flicker. I could hear the barking more clearly out there, still coming from above, still that same stuttering pattern. And under it, or maybe threaded through it, something else. A scraping sound, slow, dragging, moving down instead of staying in one place. Not inside a wall this time, in the stairwell itself. I stood at the bottom of the flight leading up to 4, hand on the railing, and did the thing every single person in every story like this does, and later gets criticized for doing. I went up. 4's landing was empty. Priya's door was shut, Nugget's barking muffled but still going strong from inside, and the hallway light up there was out entirely. Not flickering, just dead, which I noted with the part of my brain that still thought like an electrician even with my heart going like a nail gun. I looked up the next flight toward 5, and that's when I saw it stop. Not a shape, not really, not the way I'd want to describe it to a cop or a skeptical friend. A section of shadow on the wall of the stairwell between 4 and 5 that didn't match where the shadow should have been, given the angle of the one working light down on 3. It was low, close to the floor, wide across in a way a person crouching doesn't get, and it was still, that specific kind of still that isn't relaxed, isn't resting, is instead a thing actively not moving because it's decided not to move, the way a deer freezes. Except deer don't usually take up that much of a stairwell wall. I didn't move either. I don't know how long that lasted. Long enough that my legs started shaking from standing rigid on one step. Long enough that Nugget's barking behind Priya's door had gone from frantic to a lower, continuous growl. Like even the dog understood that loud wasn't the right volume for whatever was happening on the landing above him. Then the shadow moved, and it moved up, away from me toward 5 fast. That same wrongness from the window 5 nights earlier, low to the ground and too quick for the shape of it, 4 points of contact instead of 2, and along with the movement came a smell that hit me a half-second later, drifting down the stairwell like it had been shaken loose. The same burnt duct wet insulation smell from 5D's closet, except stronger now, close enough that it caught in the back of my throat. I heard a door. Not slammed, just pulled shut, firm and deliberate. The specific sound of 5C's door, which I recognized because I'd stood in front of it enough times that week to know its particular click. I didn't go up any further. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect the narrator in these stories to be braver than they actually were, and I wasn't. I went back down to 3, locked my door, checked it twice, and sat at my kitchen table with the lights on, and my laptop still open to that unfinished quote. And I did not sleep, not really, until the sky outside started going gray around 5. Priya texted the group chat the next morning. Anyone else's dog lose it around 1 a.m. Nugget's never been like this. I think something's wrong with him. Might take him to the vet. Somebody replied with a laughing emoji and a comment about full moons, which under any other circumstances I would have found funny too. I stared at that message for a long time before I decided not to reply at all. Because the thing that scared me most, sitting there in the gray early light with cold coffee I hadn't touched, wasn't what I'd seen in the stairwell. It was the door. The sound of a door closing, deliberate, like something that understood doors and understood being seen and had decided calmly to correct the mistake of being caught out in the open. Whatever was living in that shared duck chase behind an empty apartment wasn't just an animal that had wandered in through a broken vent. It knew which door was its door, and it had gone home. Here's the part where, if this were a movie, I'd be the guy yelling at the screen. Leave, just leave. Sign a new lease somewhere else, eat the fee. I didn't leave. I want to explain why. Because it wasn't bravery, and it wasn't denial either, not exactly. It was rent. I'd signed a 2-year lease 8 months earlier, back when Boston Rent was doing what Boston Rent always does, which is nothing kind to anybody. Breaking it meant 2 months penalty plus forfeiting a deposit that represented actual money I didn't have sitting around. I run my own electrical business. I don't have a company absorbing a bad month for me. So Friday morning, running on maybe 90 minutes of real sleep, I did the math on a legal pad like it was a job estimate, and the math said, stay at least until you understand what you're staying with. The building, meanwhile, acted like nothing had happened, which somehow made it worse. Friday was aggressively normal. Mrs. Fiore's granddaughter was moving boxes into the lobby for a weekend visit. Somebody had a package delivery pile up by the mailboxes that nobody claimed. The elevator was out again. Unrelated, an actual cable sensor issue Marcus had been fighting for a month. So I took the stairs past 5 twice that day, once going out to a job and once coming back. And both times the hallway looked exactly like a hallway looks. Fluorescent light doing its flicker. Fire extinguisher case still cracked. 5C's door shut, ordinary brass numbers catching the light at the same dumb angle they always had. I almost let myself believe it had been a bad week stacked on bad sleep. That's the thing nobody tells you about living next to something wrong. It doesn't announce itself constantly. It goes quiet, and the quiet does more work on you than the noise does, because you start filling it in yourself, second-guessing details, wondering if the dent in that duct really had a shape, or if you'd talked yourself into seeing one. I called my sister that night, mostly because I needed to hear a normal human voice about something that wasn't a monster. Her name's Kaylee. She lives in Providence. And she's the only person in my family who'd actually listen to something like this instead of immediately suggesting I see somebody. I didn't tell her everything. I told her the fire alarm story. The shape in the window kept it light, isn't that weird, instead of, I think something is living in my building's ductwork. You should just ask the old guy, she said. The super. Sounds like he knows something and just doesn't want the liability of saying it. He basically told me to stay out of the mechanical closet. That's not a no, Evan. That's a yes with extra steps. She wasn't wrong, and it needled at me the rest of the weekend the way she'd landed on the exact thing I'd been avoiding thinking through. That Marcus's whole reaction in the boiler room hadn't been confusion. It had been management. A guy handling a known problem the same tired way he'd probably handled it before, quietly, without paperwork, without involving people who'd ask questions he didn't want to answer. Saturday, I did something I probably shouldn't have. I pulled up the county property records online, the kind of public deed and permit history anybody can access if they know where to dig, and I looked up the building's history. Nothing dramatic jumped out. A conversion from a single family to a 6-unit in the 80s, a couple of ownership changes, a permit filed 9 years back for HVAC system repair, Unit 5C, tenant reported damage, approved, closed out, no details attached beyond the boilerplate. 9 years ago, long before Petrosian owned the place, long before Denise ever managed it, probably long before most of the current tenants had moved in. I sat with that for a while. A permit for HVAC repair tied specifically to 5C, 9 years old, closed without explanation, in a building where the current super very deliberately steered me away from that exact system. It wasn't proof of anything. It was a paper trail with a hole in the middle of it. And the hole was shaped exactly like the thing I didn't have language for yet. Sunday, I finally worked up the nerve to knock on Marcus's basement office door. A converted storage room next to the boiler with a space heater, a folding table, and a corkboard covered in work orders going back years. He wasn't thrilled to see me. I could tell that immediately, the way his shoulders came up a half-inch before he even said hello. I looked up an old permit. I told him, no preamble, because I'd decided on the walk down that preamble would just give him room to redirect me. HVAC repair 5C 9 years ago. What happened? He didn't answer right away. He looked at the corkboard behind me instead of at me, like there was something more interesting there than a guy asking a direct question. and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into something quieter than his usual gruff. "You've seen it," he said. Not a question. My stomach did something unpleasant. "I don't know what I've seen." "Yes, you do." He finally looked at me, and there was something in his face I hadn't expected. Not fear exactly, more like exhaustion. The specific tiredness of a man who'd been carrying something heavy alone for a long time, and had just been handed a reason to think somebody might help him put it down. "Close the door," he said. "I'll tell you what I know. It isn't much, but it's more than Denise has, and a hell of a lot more than that permit says." I closed the door. Marcus's office smelled like the boiler room bled into it. Hot metal, dust burning off an old radiator somewhere close by. He didn't sit. He stood with his back half turned to the corkboard, arms crossed, like a man bracing for a conversation he'd rehearsed in his head 100 times and hoped he'd never actually have to have. "9 years ago," he said. "Guy named Callahan lived in 5C. Before my time managing this place directly, I was just doing maintenance then, under the old company, before Petrosian bought the building. Callahan put in a complaint about noise in the walls. Scratching, he said. We figured squirrels, maybe raccoons. Old brick building happens more than people think. I went up, opened the return chase to check, found some damage to the ductwork, wrote it up as animal intrusion. Standard stuff. That's the permit I found." "That's the permit," he agreed. "What's not on the permit is that Callahan moved out 4 days after we closed that repair. Didn't give notice, didn't ask for his deposit back, didn't leave a forwarding address. Building never heard from him again. Owner at the time didn't care, different tenant, different rent. Nobody asked questions. And you think that's connected to what I'm seeing now?" Marcus was quiet a second. "I don't think, Evan. I know it's the same duck chase. I know it's the same unit. I know the smell you're going to describe to me before you describe it, because I smelled it myself 9 years ago, standing in that hall closet with a flashlight, same as you did." He rubbed a hand over his jaw. "I never saw anything, not directly. Callahan did, I think, though he never said it outright. Just kept saying something's in there, and wouldn't say what he meant by something. Told myself that for years. But you kept the hatch closet locked. I kept it locked because every super who's touched that duct system since has told me the same thing. Cold spots that don't make sense, noise that doesn't match any HVAC unit we've got running. And once, about 4 years back, a maintenance guy from a contractor I hired quit mid-job and wouldn't go back up there for any amount of money I offered him." He said this last part flatly, like a man reporting a fact he'd long since stopped being surprised by. "I keep the door locked. I keep tenants out of that unit when I can. And I've been quietly telling Petrosian for 6 years we need to gut that whole HVAC trunk, and I keep getting told it's not in the budget." I sat with that for a second, feeling the shape of something much bigger than I'd let myself imagine. Not a single bad week, not a fluke, but a slow, patient problem the building had been managing around instead of solving. The way people build a life around a bad knee instead of getting the surgery. I chalked it up to a guy who'd had a bad scare from an animal and was embarrassed to say raccoon. I don't ask questions I don't want answered. "I need to see the hatch closet," I said. Marcus looked at me like I'd asked to see the inside of a lit furnace. "No, you don't. I already work in that duct system. I've got a legitimate maintenance reason to be up there. If I go up on my own, unofficial, and something happens, that's on me. If I go with you, official, documented, at least there's a record of what we find." He didn't like it. I could see him not liking it in real time, the way his jaw worked before he answered. But I think some part of him, the part that had been alone with this for 9 years, filling out permits that didn't say what actually happened, quietly locking doors and hoping the problem would just stay contained, wanted somebody else to finally see it too, even if seeing it made things worse before it made them better. "Tomorrow," he said. "Daylight. I'm not doing this at night, and neither are you." We went up Monday morning a little after 9, toolbox and a heavier flashlight than I usually carried. Marcus with a ring of keys that included one I'd never seen him use, old, brass, worn smooth at the edges from decades of hands. The hatch closet sat at the far end of the 5th floor hallway, past 5C, past 5D. A door I'd walked by a dozen times without really registering it as anything other than a maintenance closet, the kind every building has and nobody thinks about. Inside, it was smaller than I expected, barely big enough for the two of us, and a rusted ladder bolted to the wall, leading up through a narrow shaft toward the building's shared mechanical space above the 5th floor, tucked under the roofline where the old HVAC trunk ran before splitting off to feed each unit's return. The smell hit before the flashlight beam did, stronger up close than anything I'd caught drifting through the stairwell. Wet insulation, scorched plastic, and underneath it something else, something almost Swedish and wrong. The kind of smell that makes your body want to back out of a room before your brain's finished processing why. Marcus's flashlight found the ladder first, and I saw immediately why nobody wanted to climb it. 3 of the rungs were bent, not rusted through, not worn, bent downward, like something heavy had been climbing and descending that ladder using far more weight and force than a person its apparent size should generate. At the base of the shaft, tucked against the wall where the light didn't reach unless you angled it right, was a pile of insulation torn out from somewhere above, matted down into something almost nest-shaped, dark with what I told myself was dust and grime, and did not let myself think too hard about being anything else. And scattered near that nest, catching the flashlight beam in small, dull glints, were things that didn't belong in a mechanical shaft at all. A shoe, child-sized, weathered gray with age. A collar, the kind you'd put on a dog, buckle rusted shut. A wallet, swollen with old water damage, the leather gone soft and dark. Neither of us said anything for a long moment. Marcus's flashlight beam had gone very still, fixed on that little pile like he was doing the same math I was doing. 9 years, 1 confirmed tenant who vanished without a trace, and God only knew how many quiet disappearances since that nobody had ever connected to a duck chase behind a hallway closet nobody was supposed to open. "We need to call somebody," I said finally, my voice sounding thinner in that small space than I meant it to. "Not Denise, somebody real." Marcus didn't answer right away. He was still looking at the wallet. 9 years I've been locking this door," he said quietly, telling myself I was containing something. I think I've just been feeding it a building full of doors it already knows how to open. We didn't call 911 that morning. That's the part I still have trouble explaining to people, the part that makes me sound complicit in something. Marcus didn't ignore it completely, though. Before we left the hallway, he photographed the wallet, the shoe, the collar, and the damaged ladder with his work phone, and filed them under an internal safety report as possible abandoned property and animal intrusion in a locked mechanical space. It was the kind of report buildings make when they want a paper trail without inviting the wrong kind of attention. Not enough. I know that now. But at the time, standing outside that closet, it felt like the most either of us could make ourselves do. Marcus locked the hatch behind us with hands that weren't quite steady, and we stood in the hallway outside 5D for a full minute, without either of us saying anything useful. "If I call this in as what it looks like," Marcus said eventually, "cops seal the building, Petrosian loses his mind. Every tenant in this place finds out there's human remains, or something close enough to it, behind a closet door 2 floors up from where they sleep, and every single one of them, including you, is out on the street with 30 days to find new housing in this market, whether or not anybody ever explains what actually happened." "That's not a reason not to call," I said, even though some ugly practical part of my brain was already doing the same math he was. "I'm not saying don't call. I'm saying let's know what we're calling about first. A wallet doesn't prove a body. A shoe doesn't prove a body. It proves people leave things behind. And God knows enough people have moved out of this building over the years without saying goodbye." He wasn't wrong exactly, even if it felt like the kind of logic a person builds specifically to buy themselves another day of not making a hard call. We agreed, badly, without really agreeing at all, more just running out of better ideas, to give it 48 hours. Marcus would quietly check with the building's insurance contact about what a full HVAC gut renovation would take to fast track, which would give him a legitimate excuse to bring in outside contractors with real equipment, maybe even get eyes up in that shaft that weren't just the two of us with a flashlight. I'd keep my head down, do my actual job, and not mention any of it to Denise, who Marcus was fairly convinced would panic in exactly the wrong direction. Call the news before she called the fire department, more worried about liability than about anybody's safety. It felt like a plan. It felt for about a day like something manageable. Then Tuesday afternoon, Priya texted the group chat again, except this time it wasn't about a dog. "Hey, has anyone seen the guy in 4C, Owen? His mail's been piling up since like Friday and his car hasn't moved." I read that message standing in a customer's kitchen in Roslindale, wire strippers in one hand, and felt something cold drop straight through my stomach. Owen, I knew him a little, mostly from the elevator. A quiet guy in his late 20s who worked some kind of remote tech job and kept to himself. His unit was on 4, directly below 5C, directly below the closet. I texted Priya back asking when she'd last actually seen him, not just his mail. She said Thursday, maybe, the day before the stairwell incident. The night Nugget wouldn't stop barking. Nobody else in the chat had anything more recent than that either. A couple people said they figured he was traveling. One person said his car alarm had gone off Saturday night, and nobody had gone to check it. Because nobody in a city apartment building checks a car alarm anymore, we're all too used to ignoring them. I finished the Roslindale job on autopilot and drove straight back, calling Marcus from the truck instead of waiting to see him in person, because 5 days of unclaimed mail in a car that hadn't moved wasn't a coincidence I could sit on until our 48 hours were up. Marcus met me in the lobby, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely rattled instead of just tired. We went up to 4 together. Owen's door was locked, obviously, blinds drawn, nothing visible through the gap at the bottom except darkness. Marcus had a master key for the building, but using it to enter a tenant's unit without cause was the kind of thing that could end his job and invite exactly the legal scrutiny he'd been trying to avoid. "We need cause," he said, standing there with the key ring in his hand, clearly hating every second of the math he was doing. "A welfare check, something legitimate." 5 days of mail and a dead car battery as cause, I said. "Call it in as a welfare check. Not us going in, actual police, actual EMTs, whatever this needs. You don't have to mention the closet. You don't have to mention any of it. Just say a tenant hasn't been seen and his mail's piling up." He made the call standing right there in the hallway, and I have to give him credit. His voice was steady, gave the dispatcher exactly what was needed and nothing more. No mention of ductwork or 9-year-old permits or a nest of old belongings 2 closets down. Boston PD sent a unit out within the hour, which for a welfare check on a guy who'd only been unreachable 5 days, felt almost fast, though I suspect Marcus's tone on the phone had done some of that work for us. They knocked. Nobody answered. They tried the super's key with Marcus present, which is standard for these things, and went in while Marcus and I stood in the hallway not looking at each other, both of us bracing for something neither of us said out loud. Owen wasn't there. Not dead, not alive, not anywhere in that apartment, which somehow felt worse than either of the outcomes I'd been dreading on the drive over. His phone was on the kitchen counter, dead. His wallet was in a bowl by the door, the normal place people keep it, the place you'd only leave it behind if you walked out expecting to come right back. The TV was off. Nothing looked disturbed, no sign of a struggle, no broken window. Nothing you could point to and call evidence of anything at all, except a guy who'd apparently stepped out of his own apartment sometime last Thursday night and never come back through the door. The officer doing the walkthrough made a note about a possible voluntary disappearance, mentioned it happens more than people think. Adults with no history of instability just deciding to walk away from a life for reasons that are theirs alone. He wasn't wrong to consider it. Statistically, he was probably even right to lead with it. But I stood in that hallway, 4 floors below a locked hatch closet full of a stranger's belongings, and one very recent, still unclaimed set of car keys sitting untouched on a hook by Owen's door. And I knew, the way you know something in your body before your brain's finished arguing with itself, that Owen hadn't walked anywhere. Something had come down for him. and it hadn't needed to open his front door to do it. The police left with a case number and a promise to follow up, which everybody who's ever actually needed a promise like that knows means somewhere between very little and nothing. A missing persons report on a healthy adult with no note, no struggle, and a wallet left behind doesn't get much urgency in a city with as many actual emergencies as Boston has on any given Tuesday. Marcus and I stood in the lobby after the cruiser pulled away, and neither of us said what we were both thinking, which was that we'd just watched the system do exactly what it was built to do, and exactly nothing about what mattered. "I'm not waiting 48 hours, I told him. He didn't argue. I think somewhere between the hatch closet and Owen's empty apartment, Marcus had crossed the same line I had. From a man managing a contained problem to a man who understood the problem had just proven it wasn't contained at all, hadn't been for years, and was, if anything, getting bolder. We went up that night. I know how that sounds. Two guys with flashlights deciding to solve what the Boston Police Department had just filed as a low-priority welfare check. And if you want to call that stupid, I won't fight you on it. But I keep coming back to one thing when people ask me why I didn't just leave it alone. Why I didn't pack a bag and go stay with my sister in Providence until somebody official figured it out. It's this. Whatever was living in that duck chase didn't need me to go looking for it. It already knew exactly where every door in that building led. Leaving wouldn't have made me safer. It would have just meant not knowing, and not knowing I'd already learned is its own kind of unsafe. Marcus brought a crowbar this time. Not for the ladder, just for his own nerves, I think, and a headlamp instead of a handheld, so he'd have both hands free. I brought the biggest flashlight I owned, and God help me, the framing hammer out of my truck, which felt like nothing against what we'd already seen move but felt like marginally less than nothing against my hands. The hatch closet smelled worse than it had that morning. Thicker, closer. The kind of smell that tells your body a threshold has changed before your mind catches up to why. Marcus went up the ladder first, testing each bent rung before trusting it, and I followed close enough behind that his headlamp threw enough light for both of us. The mechanical space above the 5th floor was bigger than I'd expected. A low, cramped crawl space running the width of that side of the building, ductwork branching off in every direction like ribs, insulation hanging in torn strips from places it had clearly been pulled apart rather than worn through. And at the far end, past where our flashlights could comfortably reach, was a gap in the brick. Not part of the original construction. I'd bet my license on that. A rough opening knocked or clawed through into what must have been an old chimney flue, sealed off decades ago when the building switched heating systems, and never fully closed upright. That's where the sound came from. Low, wet, breathing, not human breathing, too slow, too deep, with a catch at the end of each exhale like something dragging air across a throat that wasn't built quite right for it. I want to describe what I saw next as clearly as I can, because I've spent months since then hearing my own account get smaller and vaguer every time I tell it, my brain trying to sand the edges off something it never fully processed. What came out of that flue gap moved low and fast, weight distributed across 4 points, shoulders wide enough to nearly fill the crawl space, pelt patchy and dark, concentrated thick across its back, and thinning to almost nothing along flanks where the skin showed through, stretched tight and faintly shiny like scar tissue that never finished healing. One shoulder sat lower than the other, some old injury that hadn't set right, giving its gait a stutter, a drag, that made it sound less like an animal and more like something wounded and furious about being wounded. Marcus swung the crowbar before I'd even finished registering what I was looking at. It connected. I heard it connect. A solid, wrong sound, meat and bone under matted fur. And the thing recoiled with a noise that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite a scream. Something in between that I still hear some nights when the building settles wrong in my new apartment. It didn't run from us so much as reposition, circling low along the crawl space wall, and in the wild swing of my flashlight I caught its face for maybe half a second. Jaw hinged wrong, teeth built for tearing rather than talking, and eyes that weren't glowing, weren't supernatural, just reflecting our own lights back at us the way any animal's eyes will, which somehow made it worse, made it real in a way glowing eyes never could have. Marcus grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise and hauled me toward the ladder, And I want to be honest that I don't remember deciding to run. I remember deciding, and I remember being 3 rungs down. Everything between those 2 moments is gone, the kind of gap your mind keeps for you when the alternative is carrying the whole thing intact. We got the hatch shut. Marcus threw the crowbar through the door handles as a makeshift brace. Not that we thought it would hold against something that had bent steel rungs like they were nothing, but because doing something with your hands is sometimes the only thing keeping you upright. We stood in that hallway breathing like we'd run a mile, and Marcus said the one thing that stuck with me longer than anything else from that whole year. Longer than the smell, longer than the sound of its breathing, longer even than the shoe and the wallet and the collar we found that morning. Every building this old, he said, still catching his breath, staring at that closed hatch like it might not stay closed, has rooms nobody's supposed to open. The mistake people make is thinking that means those rooms are empty. I've thought about that line more times than I can count since. Because I don't think he meant just the hatch closet. I don't think he even fully meant just that building. Nothing happened for 3 weeks after that. I mean that literally, and I mean it in the specific way that turned out to be its own kind of unbearable. No barking, no shadows on the stairwell wall, no smell drifting down from the 5th floor. Marcus had an emergency contractor in within 4 days. Official reason on the work order: structural assessment, HVAC trunk, Unit 5 corridor. Whatever internal safety report he'd filed had done just enough to get the work approved as a building hazard, not enough to turn the 5th floor into a crime scene. The contractors welded a steel plate over the flue gap, resecured every loose grill on that side of the building, and replaced the hatch closet door with something heavier, keyed differently. A lock even Marcus's old brass key wouldn't open anymore. Nobody found anything else up there. No remains, nothing that could be tied conclusively to a missing person. Nothing you could hand a detective and say, "Here, this proves what happened." The wallet and the shoe and the collar did eventually leave the building, but not because anyone kicked in a door or sealed off the 5th floor. Marcus's internal report got forwarded, quietly and late, to the building's insurance contact, and from there to someone in the city who handled found property. As far as I know, they still sit in some property room downtown, unconnected to anything, a handful of objects with no story attached that anyone's willing to believe. Owen's case stayed open. Stayed exactly where it was the day the officer wrote possible voluntary disappearance, and moved on to whatever came next in his shift. I looked him up online once, months later, hoping for some update, a sighting, anything. Nothing. Just an old company bio from his job, a LinkedIn that hadn't updated, a Facebook that friends still occasionally posted memories to like people do when they're not sure whether a person is gone or just gone quiet. Denise never learned the real reason for the HVAC work. She got an invoice, approved it, told the tenant chat there'd be some noise on floor 5 for a few days, and moved on to whatever else was next on her clipboard. I don't think she was being willfully blind. I think she genuinely believed the version of the building she'd been handed. Old pipes, old ducts, ordinary maintenance. Because that version required nothing further from her, and people generally believe whatever version of a thing lets them stop thinking about it. I went back to work. That's the strange, almost insulting truth of surviving something like this. The world doesn't pause to let you process it. I had panels to install, quotes to send, an invoice from a Roslindale job that had gone unpaid for 6 weeks that I actually had to chase down, and somewhere in the middle of all that ordinary noise, the thing that had been living in my building's walls for who knew how many years quietly, officially, became a problem that was handled. Except handled isn't the same as gone, and some part of me knew that the whole time. The same way you know a wound's healed wrong even after the stitches come out. A stiffness, a wrongness, that never quite goes away even when everyone around you agrees the injury's behind you. Priya moved out at the end of that month. Not because of anything she said out loud. Officially, it was a job relocation. Nugget in a carrier, a moving truck double parked on Center Street on a gray Tuesday. But she hugged me goodbye longer than the situation really called for. And right before she got in the truck, she said, quiet like she needed to say it to somebody who'd understand and didn't much care if I believed her. Nugget still won't go near that side of the hallway. Hasn't since that night. Dogs know things, Evan. I don't care what anybody says. I didn't argue with her. I'd stopped needing convincing a long time before that. Marcus retired 2 months after the repair, earlier than anyone expected, citing his knees, which nobody questioned because his knees actually were bad and had been for years. But the last real conversation we had, standing in that boiler room one final time, while he cleared out 3 decades of accumulated tools and paperwork, he told me something he hadn't said before, something he'd apparently been sitting on since Callahan's disappearance 9 years earlier. I checked the building's permit history going back further than that once, he said, not looking up from the box he was packing. Way further. There's a gap in the records from the 60s, right around when they did the original single-family to units conversion. No inspection report for that flue closure, no sign-off. Whoever did that work never filed it, and nobody after them ever asked why. You think it's been in there that long? He shrugged, the kind of shrug a man gives when he's decided some questions aren't worth the peace of mind they'd cost him to actually answer. I think buildings remember things longer than people do, he said. And I think whatever gets sealed up inside one doesn't always stay sealed just because you stop thinking about it. I moved out in October, into a newer building in Somerville, the kind of place with central air and ductwork you could see the entire run of just by opening one hall closet. No shared chases, no century-old flues sealed up behind drywall. Nothing a building could quietly forget about itself. I told my sister it was about the commute. That was true, technically. It just wasn't the reason. For a while, that was the end of it. I did my job, slept fine most nights, and the story of the 5th floor became something I only told a handful of people, usually late, usually after enough beers that the telling felt less like confession and more like something safely filed away. I want to say I'd made peace with not knowing what actually happened to Owen, or Callahan before him, or however many names existed further back than either of them, buried in gaps in permit records nobody had thought to question. I hadn't, not really. But I'd learned to carry it the way you carry any unsolved thing, quietly, off to the side, not load-bearing anymore. Then, this past February, I took a job in Charlestown. Old triple-decker, converted row house, connected on both sides to identical buildings from the same block, the same era, the same builder, the kind of construction that was everywhere in Boston before anybody thought to give each house its own separate everything. The homeowner wanted a new outlet run through an upstairs closet. Nothing complicated. A Tuesday afternoon job. I opened that closet and the smell hit me before the flashlight did. Not identical. I want to be precise about that, because precision is the only thing that's kept me sane about any of this. It wasn't the same smell exactly. No burnt plastic edge this time. More like standing water and something gone slightly sour underneath. The kind of smell a narrower brain would file under old pipes and move on from. But it was close enough, familiar enough in its wrongness, that my hands stopped moving on the outlet cover, and I just stood there in that closet for a full minute, feeling something cold settle into the same place it had settled a year earlier. I checked the return grill. 3 screws instead of 4. A dent in the ductwork, small, easy to miss if you weren't looking for that exact shape. I didn't say anything to the homeowner. I finished the outlet, told her the duct looked like it could use servicing sometime, gave her a name for an HVAC guy I trusted, and left. I sat in my truck outside that row house for 20 minutes before I could make myself drive away, running back through everything Marcus had told me that last day in the boiler room. A permit gap from the original conversion, decades old, nobody ever asking why a chimney flue got sealed the way it did. Boston is full of buildings like that, whole blocks of them. Brownstones and triple-deckers built shoulder to shoulder in the 1800s and early 1900s, sharing walls, sharing chimneys, sharing duct chases that got carved up and half abandoned every time a building changed hands, or got subdivided into units nobody thought to fully separate from the structure next door. I'd spent 14 years as an electrician crawling through exactly that kind of infrastructure, without ever once asking the question that's kept me up more nights than I'd like to admit, since that February afternoon in Charlestown. What if it was never really my building's problem? What if it never lived in one closet, one flue, one bent ladder 9 years running? What if what Marcus and I sealed off wasn't a den? It was a door. One door in a city that's still got hundreds of them, built into walls nobody's opened since before anyone currently living there was born, running behind drywall and hallway closets from Jamaica Plain to Charlestown to wherever else this city forgot to finish separating one old building from the next. I know how that sounds. I know exactly how it sounds, because I've heard myself say it out loud exactly once, to Marcus on the phone, back in March. He was quiet a long time after I told him about the closet in Charlestown. Long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "You planning on going back in there?" he finally asked. "No," I said, and I meant it. I'm an electrician, not whatever kind of person goes looking for a second time for something that already took a swing at me with a crowbar and barely flinched. "Good," he said. "Some doors you don't reopen. You just remember where they are, and you make sure you're never standing alone in front of one at night." I think about that a lot now, more than I think about the shape in the crawl space or the smell, or even Owen's wallet sitting untouched in a bowl by his front door. Not because it's the scariest part of what happened to me, because it's the part that never actually ends. Somewhere in this city, right now, there's a hallway closet nobody's opened in years, a grill hanging by one screw instead of 4, a permit that got filed and closed out decades ago with no real explanation attached to it. And somebody's about to move into that unit, hang their coats in that closet, and never think twice about what's on the other side of the wall, because why would they? That's the whole design of it. That's how it's lasted this long. I know what I went through is bizarre, and I've stopped expecting anybody to fully believe it. But every time I hear about an old Boston building getting gutted for renovation, I find myself hoping, quietly, that whoever's doing the demo checks every closet twice before they call the job finished. Some of those walls have been keeping secrets a lot longer than anybody currently living behind them.